Tarik, thank you so much for joining us today. I believe you're fresh back from Germany, where they've just 2 days ago had this big election. I wanted to first start by asking you, who do you think can feel satisfied after this election? Which politicians can feel like winners?
Yes, that's a very good question. And first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. So the election result wasn't a big surprise because the polls were quite spot on. So a lot of reactions were kind of baked in already a little
Hmm.
bit. Of course, what we saw is that all three parties that formed the last government, so the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Free Democrats, they all lost votes in the elections. And basically all opposition parties gained votes. Now, the big winner in terms of vote gain is the far right AfD. So they nearly doubled their result. They did very, very well. The strongest party is the Christian Democrats. So they're going to lead the next government. So they're naturally quite happy with the election result. But given how unpopular the government was, their election result with about 28% of the vote is actually not that great. It's their second worst historical result. So while they will lead the next government, they can be happy, I guess. They will be happy, but it's not an exceptional result. And finally, the big surprise was Die Linke, the left party, that was really already seen as a kind of dead party a couple of months ago. And they really outperformed expectations and they did very, very well during the campaign and then came out at over 8% of the vote.
As you say, the results could be seen as a pretty strong rejection of the three governing parties from the previous coalition, the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP. For those of us not living in Germany, why is the outgoing government so unpopular?
Yes. So there are several things that are coming together here. The first is that something that's nearly happened globally. Currently in elections, government parties are losing. This happens basically everywhere. And the main reason we give from a political science perspective is economics, inflation, really. So this is a rule of political science, really. When the economy is going down, people are more likely to support opposition parties. And inflation seems to be particularly strong in having this effect. We don't know so much about this because the last period where we had really strong inflation in Europe and North America is so long ago that usually when we test this idea about the relationship between the economy and government support, it's used unemployment rates and growth. But inflation really seems to make people very, very upset with the government, and so they become much more likely to support the opposition. A second thing is that there was a lot of infighting in the coalition, a lot of things that they didn't get done. The chancellor was seen as a bit too passive, not involved enough. And so the government just didn't really work well together, which is a second reason why it was unpopular. And maybe a third one, as a result of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, especially energy prices went up a lot in Germany. Again, there's this relationship with inflation, but this really hit Germany, every aspect of German social, economic, and political life quite hard. And so again, although the government found some solution, it was just not a great situation to be in.
The most likely coalition seems to be between the two legacy mainstream parties, the CDU, CSU, and the SPD. But I can't help but wondering, with what you just said about how much the previous coalition had all this infighting, it seems like those two parties are likely to have just as much infighting, if not more. Do the SPD, do the Social Democrats actually want to be in government? And what is in it for them? And who's holding the cards in these coalition negotiations?
So the German Social Democrats like being in government a lot. They already governed they governed 23 out of the last 27 years. So they've been in government a lot, and they seem very likely to join this government coalition again. In contrast to the last coalition, those two parties have governed together a lot in the past 15 years. So those so-called grand coalition, not so grand anymore now, but they used to be called grand coalitions. That was a quite regular outcome of elections as a government in the past 20 years. And this so-called traffic light coalition that we had, that was really a new attempt. And those parties had never governed together. It was also the first time that it was three parties governing together. And so that had challenges that apparently they weren't really used to. So in a way, one has a bit the feeling that the natural partners are getting back together, and they seem very prepared to do this.
With this result giving the AfD nearly 21% of the total vote, you could arguably say that they have effectively now become a kind of mainstream political party themselves, despite being under surveillance by the intelligence services for extremism. How can those of us outside Germany understand the process by which that became possible?
There are two crucial mechanisms leading to the normalization of a far-right party. The first is positional accommodation. So what that means is that established parties move toward the far-right on certain issues, especially on the issue of immigration. So when established parties emphasize immigration, speak of immigration mostly as a problem, and promote more restrictive measures, this really normalizes the position on the rhetoric of the far right. That's the first mechanism. And the second is then something like direct collaboration. So a lot of European countries used to have something that we like to call a cordon sanitaire around the far right. So just a rule of non-collaboration with the far right. When this crumbles, then again, this legitimizes the far right. And so we've seen this step by step in the German context, where there still is a quite strong cordon sanitaire, much stronger than, for example, in the Netherlands or in Austria. But it has started to crumble. And again, this has given the far right this normalization. And then a third factor is as self-reinforcing one, which is electoral success, right? When you see that the party is successful, then it must somehow be more normal. When there are dozens of newspaper articles or news pieces on why is the AfD doing so well, then for many people what they see is, oh, the AfD must be doing well, so maybe me supporting it isn't so wrong anymore. So the stigma around these parties disappears.
One of the German politicians who's been criticized for coming close to collaborating with the AfD on certain bills is Friedrich Merz, the man who leads the Christian Democrats and who is likely to be chancellor now. What kind of chancellor do you think he will be?
So my assessment of this has really changed in the last months, I would say. It was always clear that Friedrich Merz would be very conservative, like old school conservative, reactionary type, right? So this is really his position. Every time he talks about women, it's either wives or daughters, or right. So it's a very old school conservative politician.
Definitely not the new Merkel.
No, exactly. And really moving the party away from where Angela Merkel was. So I thought he's that, but still somewhat principled, right? So not this new kind of lying, populist, opportunist type of right-wing politician that we see increasingly across the world. However, throughout the last months, I think we've seen that he is very willing to use these similar tactics to increase support. We've seen this around this vote in the Bundestag that you already mentioned, where they pushed a motion through with the support of the AfD. So my assessment there has really changed, and that has made me very pessimistic about where he's going to go with the country in this regard.
And in terms of what he actually wants to do policy-wise, I mean, how much of a plan does he have for fixing the problems, the kind of problems that voters have been flagging during this election campaign?
Yes, so Germany has a big problem in the sense that it's very clear that there's certain types of spending that they want to increase, especially defense spending, which I think the reason for why they want to do this is clear. But it's not so easy because in Germany, constitutionally, there's a so-called debt brake. And without going into too much detail about this, the idea is that there's a limit to what you can do spending-wise and how much debt you can make as a government. So if you can't increase debt, then you only have two other options. You can cut spending, right? So this is the other thing. And then there would be the debate around what spending to cut, or you increase taxes. So you increase income. And the CDU has already said that it's unwilling to reform the debt brake and to increase taxes, which would mean spending cuts, which the Social Democrats are unlikely to accept. And also the spending cuts that the CDU-CSU has proposed will be nowhere close to enough to actually to get the money in that they would need to increase defense spending in this way.
So yeah, defense is one of the big things that's been a topic during the campaign, and something that a lot of outsiders across Europe are looking at as Germany, the biggest economy in Europe. But there are a lot of other things that are also very important in Germany. I mean, for example, climate change or housing that don't seem to have got much attention during this election campaign. I mean, now that we're presumably going to get this CDU-SPD government, do you think they'll be able to do anything about these issues that weren't political priorities during the campaign?
It's a very good question. We really have not seen these issues on the agenda in the last months in the campaign at all. During all of the debates, the issue of climate change really didn't come up at all, which is a massive failure not only of the politicians involved, but also of the media, given that just objectively climate change is going to be a huge challenge and there's no way around it. And the one issue that really dominated everything was immigration. And that is really unfortunate, given that it's really taking away space to debate these fundamental issues that Germany has to solve. And these weren't tested during the campaign. So it's very difficult to say what is the exact plan of these parties, because of course they have something in their programs, but it hasn't really been debated in a way that would give citizens or even more, professional observers like me a good sense of where things are going to go.
I mean, the parties that you would normally expect to be pushing those kind of issues and putting them front and center of their campaigns generally tend to be parties on the left. Most of the reporting about how these elections have gone has focused on the right-wing parties. Can you tell us a bit more about what has actually happened on the left in this election? Are there any left-wing politicians who you think can actually feel pretty pleased with the results?
Yeah, so we have three parties more or less on the left in Germany: the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Left Party. And so the Social Democrats have really shifted to a very managerial, centrist type of political position over the last years. Olaf Scholz was really the epitome of this, but I already mentioned they're in government so often that really governing has become their ideology to a certain degree. The Greens have been this very successful challenger in Germany for this, you could say, hegemony on the left, and they did very well in the last election. They are still quite close to the Social Democrats in terms of their vote shares, also in many regions. So they're really competing for the first spot. However, what this has resulted in is the Greens also strongly focusing on the political center. And the Greens have passed a lot of policies. They've contributed to these draconian measures against asylum seekers, where a lot of progressive voters did not feel represented by the party anymore. And this is the reason why the Linke, the left party, has been so successful in this election, because they were able to get to these voters in. They had a very principled position on immigration, also on Gaza, at least much more than other German parties. And these were really issues that progressives and especially young people cared about a lot. And so they could really channel the sentiment, and this is why they've been so successful in this election.
I've been finding it quite difficult to work out quite like how depressed to feel about these election results, considering the picture is quite mixed. And I mean, compared to where I live in the Netherlands, as you've already mentioned, the far right are already in power, and that doesn't seem like it's going to happen in Germany. So from the kind of Dutch perspective, I kind of feel like I can breathe a sigh of relief almost, that it wasn't worse. Do you think that's reasonable to think that these set of results can be seen as kind of not as bad as they could have been?
It's true that they're not as bad as it could have been, but they're pretty bad. I mean, it's an election with very high turnout, right? It was kind of we haven't had turnout this high in decades, and still we had over 20% voting for a far right party that is really far to the right, right? This is kind of strong neo-Nazi ties type of party, and that is frightening. And that in combination with a political establishment on the center left and center right that has really moved to the right as well, trying to accommodate these positions. And we've seen this in all other countries that, slowly this just helps to legitimize the far right and gets them into these positions of power. The difference between the Netherlands and Germany is just Germany is a bit of a latecomer. People often emphasize German history in this regard, but that might be the case, but it might not. The fact is just we've started a little later in Germany, and so the Netherlands, this has been going on for 25 years now. These kinds of debates, and so the far right is so normalized, which you could see in the last election. And in Germany, Germany's just a bit of a laggard, but Germany seems very much on the same track as many other countries in Europe at the moment, which is why I'm unfortunately not very optimistic or relieved by this election.
In terms of what actually happens next, Tarik, can you talk us through it? When can we actually expect a new government to be in place?
They're determined to do it very quickly. So Friedrich Merz talks about Easter, which I guess would be in less than 2 months. And usually these coalition negotiations can go on for quite a while. But there is a sense of urgency. There's also this allows the parties to reduce the intra-party conflict around potentially joining a coalition, saying we have to do this now, we have this global responsibility, is of course a good way to also shut down intra-party debate if one should join a coalition. So I think given the context, it could go quite quickly. There also only really is one option, and so this should make it faster.
You're a professor of European politics. So if we look at this like in the broader European perspective, do you see any sign that we might be reaching peak far right in Europe anytime soon, or is there any hint of the tide turning, or any parts of the continent where you feel we can be a bit more optimistic yet?
Unfortunately, the answer is no. It really looks.
Thanks a lot, Tarik. So glad we invited you here today.
If you want good news, I'm not the best person to have on your podcast, unfortunately. No, so I mean, right, we're seeing things getting worse nearly everywhere. I think the only country that still sticks out as a bit of an exception is Spain. But in most countries, the far right is gaining. Of course, we saw this big change in Poland. But also what Poland shows is that it's not done with winning an election, right? The far right doesn't disappear just because they've lost one election. And so internationally, Trump and Musk are going to disappear at some point, but what they stand for isn't going to magically disappear. And they showed what you can do with this agenda and how you can get power, and why wouldn't other rich people do the same thing as Elon Musk has done now? And so unfortunately my outlook there is very pessimistic, and I can't say anything else, unfortunately.
My one personal hope, which may be completely unfounded, is that I feel like still a lot of Europeans find Trump and Musk repulsive. Also, some who might be tempted to vote for the far right. And yeah, I was like a tiny bit pleased that even when JD Vance and Musk were endorsing the AfD didn't see much bump in the polls after that. So, yeah, I don't know whether that's anything to be excited about, but
So, of course, right, there are national flavors to what these politicians do and what is popular and not popular. And I think people are repulsed by Trump and Musk also because of questions of style and some aspects of their politics. And let's be clear, JD Vance is a fascist, and this is something I don't use as an expression a lot for contemporary politics. But this is the version we're talking about. So Geert Wilders might not be a fascist, and he may just understand his country a bit better in terms of what he can say publicly and what he just won't say. But that distinction isn't making me particularly optimistic. What's making me optimistic maybe is that in Germany still we have seen these large protests and people are willing to organize and they're willing to fight, and civil society is ready to do it. The frustrating thing, and many activists and civil society actors have told me this, the frustrating thing for these actors has been that they didn't feel represented at the political level anymore. What they say is, we know the far right, we know how to fight the far right, but we are lacking political actors that really take our concerns into account and not are all focusing on how to get these far right voters back by appeasing the far right, really.
I mean, is that the main thing that you see as needing to change if there is to be any hope in stopping the far right from actually reaching power in Germany? If we look ahead to 5 years' time, Alice Weidel, the leader of the AfD, she said that she wants the party to be the biggest by the next elections. And if you look at the trajectory, it seems like she might get that wish. I mean, what do other parties do? What do other political actors do to stop that from happening?
The most important thing is that you have to uphold a cordon sanitaire. You cannot collaborate with these parties. As soon as you do, you really open the floodgates, and people on the right then basically ask themselves, why should I not vote for this party over the mainstream right one? And you very clearly saw this in the Netherlands in the last electoral campaign. But this isn't enough, of course. The left needs its own program. The left needs to, again, stand for a vision of the future that is not just some managerial problem solving, but actually an idea of inclusive societies that deal with the massive amounts of economic inequality. And they need to be confident and really get back into the business of shaping people's opinions and identities. So what I always say kind of provocatively is that the left doesn't do enough identity politics. The left has given up on shaping people's identities, actually, and they're especially currently just too scared to do it because they think it'll have negative electoral consequences.